Tonight we are going to look at a lesson from Genesis chapter 16, really the whole of it. Now we'll hit parts of it, we're not going to read the whole thing, but it's based on this 13th verse, and it's about Hagar, who was Sarah's handmaid, and the events that surrounded Sarah having Abraham go into Hagar to produce seed, trying to do God's will better than what God had planned, not really trusting in God. But the basis of the lesson, again, for verse 13, so she called on the name of the Lord who spoke to her. You are a God of seeing, for she said, truly here I have seen him who looks after me. And thus we have the title of the lesson, Him Who Looks After Me. But there are a lot of important things about this, and the big thing, one big thing is we cannot escape the all-seeing eye of God. God sees everything, knows everything that's going on. He even knows what's in our heart, and that's the worst thing about it. Well, it's really good that we know that, but our hearts have to be correct in the things that we do, no matter what. But what happens when people who claim to be God's people do bad things, or don't do things the way that they're supposed to do? When they kind of let things get out of control. More importantly, what does God do in those types of situations? Well, this whole chapter, as we go down through it, will help us to understand what God does and how God puts things kind of back in the order that they're supposed to be, and really leaves it up to us to deal with the problems that we create, but make them a better situation. So Genesis chapter 16 is Hagar's story, and Abraham and Sarah do not look very good. They're not heroes in this chapter at all because of their behavior. Now, manipulators. We probably all know people who are manipulators, people who try to get other people to do what they want them to do, because it's like the song that Jeremy likes to hear, the 80s when we're traveling, Sirius Radio. And one of the songs of the 80s was Everybody Wants to Rule the World, Well, maybe not everybody, but a whole lot of people out there want to rule the world. They want to rule the sphere around them. They want everybody to kind of fall in line with what they expect, what they think people should do, always to make them feel good about themselves, or to as they get their way. How many of you have heard of Wanda Webb Holloway? Remember that name? She was in the news a few years ago because she's a woman from Channelview, Texas, and she's known for attempting to have the mother of her junior high daughter's cheerleaders, squad captain or whatever, the mother killed because that daughter and her daughter were kind of rivals. It's not that she wasn't going to get on the team, she wanted her to be captain of the team. So she attempted to hire a hitman to kill that little girl's mother. You talk about selfishness, and we talked a little bit about selfishness this morning from the rich man with barns, the man who the blunders of a successful man. You put successful man in quotation marks. Well, that didn't work out very well, did it? It kind of backfired. But think of the extremes that people will go to because they desire to live out their lives through the lives of others. And it happens with all different types of people. How many fathers want their sons to be the star football player, the star basketball or baseball player, and they push them and they try to make things work. They manipulate circumstances to try to get that done. So Sarah thought that she could live her life through Hagar. Remember, God promised Abraham that if he would move from the most modern city in the world at that time, Ur of the Chaldees, out into the wilderness and live in tents, take his wife with him, okay, that he would have descendants that would be more than the sand and at the seashore and more than the stars in the sky. And up to this point, that has not happened. He doesn't have an heir. And Sarah's getting older, and she doesn't feel that it's going to work out for her having children. So she's going to kind of live out this plan through her slave, bondwoman, Hagar. Now, thinking that she was barren, she proposed a worldly practice to solve her problem. And this wasn't so much a worldly problem. It was a spiritual problem. It was a spiritual problem in the sense that God says, when the time is right, it's going to happen. Just be patient. God knows the right time to bring these things about. So she proposed this worldly practice of giving her handmaid to her husband, and the child that would come from this encounter, so to speak, would then become her child because it was her slave. You know, today we kind of call those things, surrogate mothers, out here. And that doesn't always work. It doesn't always work because the mother, the true birth mother, will get attached to the child, and lots of times she ends up with the child and the money that was paid to her to have that child, and there's not a whole lot that can be done about it. So it was a worldly practice trying to solve this. Now here's what she's thinking, in my opinion. She thought Abraham would look at her differently if Hagar bore him a son. Can you catch that? My husband will look at me more favorably if I allow him to have a son through Hagar, this Egyptian bondwoman. Sarah also thought that Hagar would gladly turn over her child to her, for her to raise. It's like as soon as the baby's born, the midwives take the baby and give it to Sarah. And it's her child. But that was the practice of that day. Listen, you cannot build a normal future on an abnormal present. There's a lot of things. We talked about things that happen in our world today, how that the way parents will look at family situations can cause great damage to children in so many ways. And can you imagine what's going to happen with this family? Well, we don't have to imagine. We can read the story through the scriptures and find out that this wasn't a good thing. It was not only not God's way, it just wasn't a good way to proceed. The world allowed for a man to raise seed from his wife's bondwoman, but again, that's not God's way. But manipulators, again, they try to live their lives through other people. Abraham wasn't completely innocent in this, was he?
Probably not.
No, he wasn't, because he thought that if he did this, it would make Sarah happy. So what's he doing? He's trying to manipulate Sarah's happiness. My wife says if I go over and have an encounter with this woman, it'll make her happy. Now, that doesn't work. Doesn't work at all. But a little bit more, maybe it'll bring peace at home. maybe this will work out, that Hagar has a baby, gives it to Sarah, and Sarah will quit her complaining, she'll quit her whining, she'll quit blaming God, just you name it, whatever. And perhaps he had a little bit of lust in his heart for Hagar too. And now as he's looking at it, well, this is Sarah's idea, not my idea. So, I got this little bit of lust, so that's going to make it all right because my wife says it's okay. And of course, we understand that it's not. He couldn't blame his wife for his adultery, and in God's sight, that's what it would be. So later on, Abraham tried to manipulate God in this whole thing into accepting Ishmael. Remember, right before Isaac is born, it's like the year later, oh, God, if you'd just accept Ishmael, because he loved Ishmael. He truly did. And Ishmael was kind of like a man's man as he was getting into those teenage years. Something that Isaac really wasn't as he was growing up. But even before that, oh God, if you could just accept Ishmael, we wouldn't have to worry about this anymore. You wouldn't have to be promising me that Sarah will have a child. So he tries to manipulate God. They all, in essence, try to manipulate God, but it's not working. How about Hagar? You think she was a manipulator? Now remember, she's an Egyptian, she's a slave, and what does she do? She does a lot of work, right? She takes care of Sarah. That had to be a lot of work because of the way Sarah was complaining and carrying on. Probably nothing satisfied her. She had to leave that big, beautiful house or mansion in Ur of the Chaldees. There she is, living in tents out in the backwood, or not even woods there. It's just, in the desert. But Hagar thought her status would be upgraded and her fortune would change. She thought her life was going to get better if she participated in this. So as a slave, she was forced into this relationship with Abraham by Sarah. And in verse 3, it's kind of like the idea that she's got the idea she's going to be a secondary wife. In other words, she's not going to be a slave anymore. She's not going to be a bondwoman. She's going to have some status within this extended family of Abraham's servants, or his workers, all the people that is in his little family unit there. And from her culture, again, she believed she would be this secondary wife to Abraham. She thought that she would be treated as one of the family, rather than this bond girl, this Egyptian, this foreigner. And you probably heard stories of young guys go out and they find a girl and they propose marriage and they get married and they brings her home to meet the family, and her family rejects her. How terrible that is. How terrible that would have to be. But she thought she was going to be a part of the family, not just a bond person, not just someone there to serve. And she probably believed that being with child would make her work easier. She wouldn't have to do as much. Oh, she'd be kind of pampered, somebody else would go fetch the water. Somebody else would go fetch the wood. Hey, look, I'm in this condition. And she thought that Abraham and Sarah would treat her better. And boy, wasn't she wrong. Or wasn't she? Boy, was she wrong. I'll put it that way. Get my knot out of there. She was wrong because this just wasn't going to be a good situation. When Hagar conceived, she saw that her relationship with Sarah changed. it did change. But it changed for the worse because Sarah's false kindness and promises were buried in cruelty and mistreatment. Sarah became so jealous of Hagar that she became a slave driver. Worse in the relationship, making her do more, beating her at times. And Abraham, Sarah complaining to Abraham, she's not doing enough. She thinks she's better than we are, or than I am. All this kind of stuff. And Abraham, you know how he says, well, do what you think you need to do. Just take care of the problem. And she does. And she runs away. Do you ever know of anybody that ran away?
Yes, my daughter, she decided she wanted to run away. She was a teenager. She went 1 block and came back home.
And that happens lots of times. But here was a woman who was being beaten and all. And for your daughter coming back, she might have got some punishment. She might have been grounded for a while or whatever. But for Hagar, that was a capital offense. She could have been killed for running away from her master, Sarah. But she saw things as so bad that she felt she had to run away. So she was willing to risk everything to get away from evil and to find some peace in her life. Because that peace that she thought she was going to get, the change that she thought she was going to get, it didn't happen. It got worse for her. So, what lesson is there? It's foolish to think that controlling other people's lives will make us happy. It doesn't. It's just going to make it worse because the people whose lives we're trying to manipulate, to control, they're going to resent it, and that's going to cause them to be driven away. Sarah became jealous, and Hagar played to that jealousy there in the beginning. Yeah, she saw that Abraham was kind of okay with it, and she would do things to kind of put herself in Abraham's way and to get between Abraham and Sarah. And it just made things worse. So Sarah's pride was wounded, and she retaliated there in verse 6. Sarah thought that making things harder on Hagar would solve her problem, would undo her sin. Because remember, it was her plan in the first place. It was her suggestion. So what do? What's the first thing most people try to do when they find out they've sinned?
Hide.
Blame it on somebody else. Yeah, blame it on somebody else. So here, Sarah, no, it's not my fault. It's Hagar's fault. Look what she's doing. If she just played by my rules, if she just do what I planned, this wouldn't happen. Well, her plan was flawed from the very beginning. So Hagar was beaten for doing what was the right thing, or doing not the right thing, but what she was told to do. She was beaten for doing what she was told to do. And Hagar wasn't about to tolerate such abuse. She fled for safety. It took an angel to turn Hagar around. But that came with a promise of blessings upon her descendants. A message from God. Go back to where you're supposed to be. Yeah, put up with Sarah. Have this child. God allows Sarah to manipulate him. And that's why Hagar is sent back. Why didn't anybody go to look for Hagar? Why didn't some of Abraham's men go out to find her? She's a runaway slave. Why not go get her? Bring her back. Make an example out of her. Slaves aren't to do this. I could just imagine Sarah was back there saying, don't worry about it, Abraham. It's better that she's gone. It's better that she's out of here. She's a troublemaker, Abraham. Let her go. But as we see through this passage, when the Lord appears to her, the name that is used of God here is El Roi, R-O-I. And in the Hebrew, that means the God who sees. The God who sees. God saw Hagar. God saw her pain, saw what was going on. And even though she wasn't perfect in this situation, she hadn't acted perfectly in this situation, God still saw the problem that she was in. God saw how Sarah treated her after Hagar had tried to help her. And even though Hagar had some ulterior motives going on there, still she was just doing what she was told to do. The Lord appeared to Hagar in a way that he never appeared to the, look in the quotes, religious Sarah. And that's what I talked about at the beginning. How does the Lord react? What does the Lord do? How does he act when religious people do bad things? What does he do? And can you imagine Abraham, who's come from a land of idolatry, and he was chosen by God because he wasn't an idolater? Sarah is with him. Can you imagine that Hagar probably had some very small household idols that she kept in her tent? And could you imagine that they're telling her how terrible she is for being an idolater? And she might have played along with Abraham's religion for a while, but still there were things of her homeland, there were things of her religion that she just hadn't really desired to give up. And could you imagine the abuse, the fun that they would make? Oh, you're worshiping a doll, or you're worshiping a piece of wood. But then you look at their actions. Abraham's actions and Sarah's actions, and that's what I said, they're not heroes in this chapter. They're shown to be very human, right? Very human beings with all the flaws right there. So the Lord appeared to Hagar, and he sent Hagar back for her and her son's well-being, because it's going to be better for them back with Abraham and Sarah than what it was going to be out in that wilderness and going back to Egypt. The Lord would care for both Hagar and Ishmael. El Roi, the God who sees. God sees what is wrong around us. He knows that we live in a fallen world. He knows that there's a ton of drugs in this community. He knows that there's a lot of problems in this community. But he expects us to live above those things.
Amen.
Because we're supposed to be different. Proverbs 15:3, the eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good. He knows everything that we are going through in this life. He knows what people think of us. He knows what people say about us because we don't participate in the things that they're doing. He knows who hurts us, and he's promised to punish those who hurt us and refuse to repent. Just like Saul of Tarsus when he was persecuting the church. Jesus saw what was going on. Jesus did what he could to change Saul. And Saul repented and he becomes the Apostle Paul. That's a wonderful story, isn't it? 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9, the Lord is not slow to fulfill his promises, some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. So he sees what's wrong around us. but he also sees what's wrong with us. With us. Psalm 18, verse 6. In my distress I called upon the Lord. To my God I cried for help. From his temple he heard my voice, and my cry to him reached his ears. God knows what we are facing more than, knows when we are facing more than what we can handle. Now he's promised that whatever we have, we can handle it. We can take care of the situation. He won't let us be tempted beyond it, but he knows when we're getting to that breaking point that he doesn't want us to go to the world. He doesn't want us, we'll use an analogy, he doesn't want us to go to the dark side. Okay? He wants us to stay in the light. So he knows what we're facing when we're facing these things. We train our children to do the best they can. But we help them when the task is pretty hard. When the task gets difficult. And we want them to ask for help. And we give it to them. And that's the same way God works with us. He knows there are things that we cannot do on our own. So when we cry for help, he comes to our aid. Providentially, he works things out. Psalm 46, verse 1, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Present? A present help in trouble? What does that mean? It means he sees, he hears, he acts. Present time, right now. He sees us right now in worship. And he knows what's in our hearts, what's in our minds, what we're doing. So we may not know what he will do or when, but we know that he'll do it, he'll act for our good. That whatever he brings forth is going to be for good. Because we've got that promise, Romans 8:28. We know that all things, let me go back. I tried to do it in the King James, and that doesn't work. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. Now, he sees what's wrong with us. He knows what's wrong with the world. He sees that around us. He sees what's wrong with us. More importantly, he also sees what is wrong in us. The flaws, right? The flaws. What is it in James? It's the faults. The faults. You know what a fault is, right? A fault is a place where the earth kind of disconnects. We call it a fault line. What happens on fault lines? Earthquakes. Earthquakes, right? Yeah. So when there are faults in us, what happens along those faults? It's like earthquakes inside us. The challenges that we have to look inside and to know inside and to make the right decisions because of what's going on inside. If emotions take over, we're going to do things for the wrong reasons. We've got to be very careful. He knows what's wrong in us. Jeremiah 17:9, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? How many times have you heard people say, oh, I just got to do what's right in my heart? Did they never read that verse? Dealing with emotions will lead you in the wrong way. We've got to find out what God's will is. What's wrong around us can become an excuse, right? Well, I live in a bad place, so, I can't really serve God and do what God wants me to do because of the terrible surroundings I've got. What's wrong in us is the real issue. It's the faults, it's the flaws in there. So God will allow bad things to happen to us so that he can show us what's wrong in us. And it's like, somebody says something to you, and because of what they said, you react to it in the way that the world would do. Well, that's just shown that there's something wrong in you, in us, in me. if I do it that way. You've probably all seen that little things going around on Facebook about the cup, the cup that somebody bumps you and what's in the cup spills, okay? Well, somebody bumps us, somebody does something wrong, and the way we react is what's in us. It's what's in our heart. We can react in the wrong way, in the worldly way. We can chew somebody out. We can, whatever. Or we can act in the proper way. And I can tell you stories of acting in the wrong way. But it's a learning process for all of us. Matthew 15, verses 19 and 20. For out of the heart come evil thoughts. The heart? Out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. And I want to trust that heart to make decisions for me? I better rethink this, hadn't I? Okay? These are what defile a person. Not what a person eats. Got to keep that Hebrew diet, right? No, not necessarily. Yeah, there are things that we shouldn't eat, okay? Things that aren't good for us, but yet that's not what causes us to sin. There's a fault in us that desires these things in our lives. So that's what we've got to be careful about. We've got to change the inside. And when we change the inside, it doesn't matter what's going on around here. Oh, it might hurt us, and we might say, oh, I feel terrible for those people. How can I help them? But we can't use it as an excuse to say, well, look how terrible they are, so if I'm not doing God's will, then it's their fault. I live in a bad place. I grew up in a bad home. God won't accept those type of excuses. So, until we understand what is wrong in us, we're not going to allow God to change us, to transform us. We've talked about it. Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Don't be conformed to the world. Don't let the world squeeze you into its image. But we need to be transformed into the image of God's dear Son. So we don't have those excuses. We don't say it's somebody else's fault. It's my fault. It's my fault, and God's exposing this because He expects me to work on it. There was unhappiness at Abraham's house. Sarah was upset because she thought she was barren. Abraham was upset because Sarah was unhappy. Right? The wife ain't happy, ain't nobody happy.
Amen.
Really, if the cook ain't happy, ain't nobody happy, but that's typically the wife, right? Okay, Hagar was upset because she was a slave. So what happens is they all manipulate each other to try to gain their own personal happiness by playing on the control game with these other people, with the other ones close to them, and trying to gain their own personal happiness, and they made their unhappiness that much greater. And then turn around and God sends Hagar back into that and says, take it. Take it. But change what's inside of you, Hagar, and it'll be all right. Wow. Trust in God. Don't trust in Abraham. Don't trust in Sarah. Don't trust in yourself. Trust in God. True happiness is not in others surrendering to us, but in us surrendering to God. That's where the true happiness is. And God will bring it to us. We'll understand. We will know the peace of God if we allow God to be the one we serve and surrender to. So hey, the lesson's yours. Thank you for your time and your attention. If you have a need, let your request be made known as we stand and sing the invitation.